Hi, this is Chris with Sanderson Test Prep, and in this video we are taking a look at some of our grid-in questions. So one important thing to understand about the progression of difficulty in an SAT math section is that there is a transition when you go from the multiple choice questions to the grid-in questions in terms of difficulty. Difficulty goes easy to hard per question type, meaning the multiple choice go easy to hard, where question 15 in the non-calculator section is the hardest multiple choice question, and then the difficulty level resets when you get to the grid-in questions. So it's really important to understand that shift because you've just dealt with a couple very difficult questions, and now we want to understand that as we move to question 16 for the grid-ins, this one is supposed to be much easier. So that's another good reason strategy-wise why we don't want to get caught spending too much time on the really hard multiple choice questions at the tail end of the multiple choice when we could potentially run out of time and not get an opportunity to answer a few of the easier grid-ins. So first and foremost, really important to understand that we're starting over with that progression of difficulty. So in theory, 16 should be relatively easy for us, and then by the time we get to question 20, it's going to quickly accelerate to something very difficult. So let's dive in and take a look at number 16. Here it says if t is greater than 0 and t squared minus 4 equals 0, what is the value of t? And a lot of times these restrictions on the value that you could get for an answer are sometimes intimidating at first glance. So a lot of times people see something like this and hesitate and say, well, I don't really know what that means. And that's where it's really helpful to understand what difficulty level you should anticipate for a question. Because here, if this is supposed to be easy, then let's just try diving in and solving this in a straightforward way without worrying too much about some of these complicated restrictions, because most of the time those restrictions are really just to avoid us coming up with an answer choice that is potentially undefined or something in a grid-in that we wouldn't be able to bubble in. They have to eliminate certain values, but the math on it's going to be straightforward in a way that we're used to. So t squared minus 4 equals 0. Add 4 to both sides. We get t squared equals 4. And we take the square root of both sides. And we get t equals 2. And that's our answer. Now the reason that they give this stipulation is because if we are being ultra careful and technical, when you take the square root of 4, t could be 2 or it could be negative 2. But for our purposes, we know that it can't be negative because they give us this restriction here. And since we're in the grid-ins, even if you tried, if you wanted to grid in a negative number, there's not a way to do it. So this question can be as straightforward as what we see here, and sometimes those restrictions can seem intimidating, but if you look past those, oftentimes you'll find a much easier equation that you can solve intuitively, pick an answer, and then move on. And that's exactly what we see with number 16. Let's move ahead to number 17. So here we have a complex looking figure with these two triangles, and then we have a pretty lengthy word problem. So let's see if we could put those two pieces together. A summer camp counselor wants to find a length x in feet across a lake as represented in the sketch above. The lengths represented by AB, EB, BD, and CD on the sketch were determined to be 1,800, 1,400, 700, and 800 feet respectively. And this is really important for us to understand what that word respectively means. And what it means is in that order. So basically, if it's AB first and then 1800 listed first for the numbers, that means 1800 matches up with AB. And if EB is listed second and the second distance listed is 1400, that means EB is 1400. And so forth. BD is listed third, 700 is listed third, so that's going to be that distance there. And then here we have CD listed fourth and 800 listed fourth. That means that that's going to be this distance here. And so now we can at least label everything with the information given, so long as we understand the word respectively, which again, for respectively, remember that it means in that order. I'll jot that down over here just as an extra side note to make sure that's something that we keep in mind, because that can show up in a lot of ways. It might even show up in something like the reading comp, where if you're telling a story, yesterday I went to the mall and took a nap, respectively, meaning in that order, or if you list several activities, I went to the mall, cleaned my room, ate a sandwich, and took a nap. Again, if you say respectively at the end of a list, then you're saying that you did those things in that order. So here, that's going to give us enough to label our figure relatively completely. We still have a few missing values. Let's see what they're asking. Segments AC and DE intersect at B, and AEB, which is this angle here, is going to have the same measure as angle CDB, which they show here. What is the value of x? Now, the core concept here is that whenever you're looking at triangles, there is a relationship between an angle and the side opposite that angle. So that ranking system is going to be the same, meaning if an angle is the smallest, the side opposite that angle will also be the smallest side of a triangle. If an angle is the medium value, then the side opposite will be the medium length side of that triangle. And if an angle is the largest angle, the side opposite that angle will be the largest side of that triangle. So there's this qualitative relationship that is highlighted by the value of an angle as it relates to the opposite side. And the reason that's important is because it lets us know which sides of our triangles would correspond. So here, this side with 1800, it's going to correspond with this side over here across from D. And then the opposite would be true for the other sides, which means that 1400 here will have a corresponding side with the 700 that we see for BD. And that's really helpful because that's where we can figure out our ratio between the two triangles. And we can see that the larger triangle is just double the value of each of the sides in our smaller triangle. So with that in place, we can go ahead and find any missing side that we need. So here, if we're being asked for x, well, that's side AE, which corresponds with side CD. These two angles here would be the same because they're both vertical angles surrounding point B. And so the sides opposite those angles, AE and CD, have to correspond, which means if the smaller triangle is 800 and we know the larger triangle, each corresponding side is double its corresponding side in the smaller triangle, that means that x will be double 800, which means that x will equal 1600 as our answer to this question. So most importantly here, we're given a figure and we're given a bunch of different numbers, but knowing where to place those by understanding the actual wording in the question so that we know what it means when they say respectively, meaning in that order, that's what allows us to label this figure appropriately and then use our knowledge of some triangle relationships in order to identify the missing side. Let's take a look now at question 18. And this is one similar to a question that we looked at in the multiple choice section where we had a system of equations. And like we said then, with a system of equations, you want to make sure that you get really comfortable with these because they show up a lot. So remember, as with any system of equations questions, first we want to look and make sure the same corresponding variables are lined up. And they already are for this. The x's and the y's are lined up, so we don't have to rewrite anything for that part of it. So then we want to see what we could do to try to cancel out a variable. And in this case, most people would look at this and say that it's a little bit easier to cancel out the x's than it is to cancel out the y's, because instead of multiplying by a coefficient of -2 to cancel out the y's, you can simply, with the x's, multiply by a negative, which means change the sign of everything. So we can do that with the first or second equation, either way. My preference, personally, I always like to, if possible, I like to try to keep the variable positive. That just helps me avoid mistakes with positives and negatives. So here, you could multiply this first equation by a negative, which means you change the sign of everything. You're distributing a negative to each value in that first equation. And then we can combine these two equations together where our x's cancel, 2y minus y, so a negative 1 plus 2 would give us a positive 1y equals, and then a positive 9 and a negative 25 will be negative 16. So that's y, but the question's asking for the value of x. So we do have to then go and plug that back in. And remember, you can plug it into either equation. So here, if we look, just to see both equations more clearly, when you have x plus y equals negative 9 or x plus 2y equals negative 25, I would look at that and say, you know, that first equation seems a little easier to me, so I want to plug my y back into that one. Again, you can choose either one, but this one's a little more straightforward. So I do x plus a negative 16 or minus 16 equals negative 9. Add 16 to both sides, and we'll get x equals positive 7. And again, this is a great place to remind us that if you come up with a negative, there's no way to grid that in. So when you are doing practice with grid-in questions, it's not a bad idea to actually practice gridding them in, not just finding the answer, so that you reinforce some of the strategies that you can use. Because on a question like this, if you get x equals negative 7 because you messed up with the positives and negatives, hopefully we're able to not just put that as our answer and move on to 19, but if we go to grid it in and recognize there's no place to put a negative, we can recognize that something went wrong and use that as a helpful hint to reevaluate the question. And oftentimes that's a great way to catch mistakes on test day. Stay tuned for our next video where we finish out